All right, with such a diverse format and so many different decks being viable, let's talk about which 5 decks are the actual top picks for this meta. Let me know what you think. Please share your thoughts in the comments down below and like the video if you enjoy it. So the YCS Bologna top cut representation was really interesting. Rescue Ace managed to have a much higher conversion rate than Unchained, and both of them were represented at 12% on day one. So of course, we're not going to be talking about only YCS Bologna, but we can still make some assumptions. Rescue Ace, like I said, had a high conversion rate, and it is just a very, very solid deck right now, so it has to be number one on today's list. Essentially, what Rescue Ace is amazing at is actually its follow-up. If you think about Rescue Ace and the majority of decks we're going to be discussing today, they all have a really strong grind game. And this is something that you have to have with these decks being popular. You just need to play a deck that's able to actually go toe-to-toe with these decks and like hang in there. And with Rescue Ace, what you put up is, of course, when your Turbulence resolves, you put up all your back row and you should be fine. With that many disruptions, which of course right now are even upgraded and better with the inclusion of SP, which is like an honorary Rescue Ace card almost. It's like really making this deck, I think, well, it already was a really strong contender. You put up all these disruptions and your opponent actually has to waste a ton of resources being able to go through all of them because you are trading with every single card, and at the end of the day, they only have 6 cards while you have a Negate, a Destruction, a Book of Moon, and then you probably have a Hand Trap, and then you might also have like a Revive from their graveyard that might disrupt them, or an SP, or like just you put up Apollousa, which has like additional disruptions. So once they are done exhausting all of their resources, what you have once they pass back to you is all of the follow-up in the world. It's like, it is insane what the Sinful Spoils engine did for the deck. It gave it consistency and it gave it that fire monster that you need on the crackback, because sometimes if they go through your entire board, it's not going to be that easy to amass enough advantage to actually win. What you really need to be doing is utilizing your field spell, get to your hydrant and then continue going. And the field spell is also such an important part of the deck. It's really, really strong. Like, it is actually insane. And at that point, if they don't OTK you, they're just gonna Turbulence set again, and you are so behind that you probably should scoop. So that's pretty much what the deck is doing. And like I said, SP is also a really, really important part of this deck because you go into it so easily. And the rest of your extra deck can be just utility. The second place YCS Bologna list played just utility cards for the most part. No elaborate engine, no Isolde, no Terahertz, although the Mud Dragon, Abyss Dweller is still like considered an extra engine, but it is good. And you can just dodge targeting negation with the help of Mud Dragon, so it like benefits your Turbulence and all of your other cards. And then for the rest of your extra deck, you just have all of these utility cards. You have enough space to play 2 SP, and I think that's really, really vital. So yeah, this deck is just like, it's really tough to contend with it because one single hand trap is not going to stop it. And at that point, you kind of hand looped yourself and you have less cards to deal with their board, which is like going to be tough to crack anyway. So yeah, I think Rescue Ace is in a really, really good spot. But let's talk about Unchained. The conversion rate was much, much lower. And I do think this has to do with the fact that, it was just this particular event. A lot of pro players just took Labyrinth, and many people played Unchained because it is fairly budget friendly. But then not a lot of those players were just good enough to make it into the top cut. And also by now, people already figured out like a lot of lines that all of these players can do to play around certain things. And if you know how to play the Unchained matchup, I think you're going to be in a fairly good spot because you actually know where and when to disrupt them. The hands can also be bricky sometimes because you do play some subpar draws, and that's just what happened. But this deck is still really, really strong because, very similar to a Rescue Ace, it really makes a difference that a player is good when they're piloting Unchained, because you need to think a couple steps ahead and you really need to decide what you're going to be playing like around and how you're going to achieve that. And what you end up on is actually a lot of disruptions that are sort of like masked, you just end with your XYZ, usually your back row, but your opponent is not going to expect everything that you're gonna throw at them. You obviously get the revive, you also get a summon from the deck, your Caesar gets to activate 2 times, and you immediately have many more disruptions actually. One of them is maybe also a hand trap, and at that point you are going to be able to overwhelm your opponent, and your follow-up is also not bad at all if you play it well. You need to conserve your resources sometimes, but if you do that well, I think you're gonna be in a good spot. Also, Unchained has a good Labyrinth matchup, which is really important, and that's kind of a spoiler. Labyrinth is the next deck on the list, but yeah, you know, this matchup is really in your favor, so that's great. And yeah, just overall, you have enough space to play all of the non-engine, so you're able to counter other decks as well, on top of you just having very decent engine on your own. So I think Unchained is still a really good choice if a good player picks the deck up, and I did want to include it on today's list. And yeah, I already spoiled Labyrinth. I think Labyrinth has to make the list today, obviously. It's just really good. If you looked at the recent builds, they kind of changed. Now you have many more pieces of furniture and arias and your trap cards, because people realized, like, you actually fairly consistently play on turn 0 and you disrupt your opponent enough to where your grind game is just going to be better than their grind game and you are going to win. Just imagine opening one of the many card combos that Labyrinth has, where you disrupt your opponent with one thing usually during their turn, and then you also maybe have a hand trap, and then you have all of your Labyrinth cards to play on your actual turn. It's really, really, really strong, and it also has a good Rescue Ace matchup, which is important with how highly represented Rescue Ace is. It's really tough to play against Labyrinth if you're a Rescue Ace player. It's just, your cards don't do anything because you cannot target Lady, and you don't have back row removal. That's like just straight up back row removal. It's weird, especially like game 1, obviously. And you are able to deal with other decks as well because you have a lot of utility. Like, you're able to destroy cards either in hand or on the field. Your Lady is protected for the most part. You are able to access your Chaos Angel. Of course, you can go for SP if you want. You have your hand traps. Like, you can just deal with a lot of things, actually. Your bounce. Like, there's a lot of disruptions that you put up that are good against a lot of different decks. And like I said, your grind game is amazing. And what you can also do is you can sort of switch things up a bit. You can play a build very similar to Dinkabui or his build if you want. But basically, he sort of took a different route, which is really interesting, including Trap Trick. So you actually have consistent access to all of these trap cards together with Arias. You make him live more. And it's just a really, really interesting build. It does not include Extravagance, which, you know, maybe if you try to find space for it, that could be important because the card is really, really good. Like, especially in a trap deck, you want to have as much advantage as possible because it is slow inherently. So yeah, you know, I found the list really interesting. I wanted to include this deck and just talk about all of the potential that it has. As for the 4th deck on the list, like, if I'm being completely honest, for the 4th and 5th deck, I was very indecisive. I still am. But as for the 4th deck, I wanted to, like, give props to Tearlament just because it had a high representation in Top Cut at YCS Bologna. And by itself, the deck is still really solid. It is able to break boards quite easily, actually, because your cards, just if you mill well, your cards do a lot and your opponent is not going to be able to contend with everything. And also, like, your destruction effects and stuff like that are not going to work against Tear. You just make them plus. So it's kind of weird how you go about actually dealing with their Tear cards. There's like Guido and Kelbag just milling your resources away. Obviously, you have the Shufflers, which can take away important stuff from the graveyard, and all of that is in engine. They don't play a lot of non-engine, but their engine is strong enough. And there's also a lot of different versions, so that's in your favor. Your opponent is not going to know exactly what build you're on. If there's the threat of Rulkalos, if you're going to be going for Toad, if not, if there's the hero package, Horus cards. So it's a little tougher to actually disrupt this deck because you don't really know what kind of extenders and follow-up your tier opponent might have. And just going first, obviously, again, if your RNG is good, you make a really, really formidable board. It's just that the RNG is also a downside, obviously. So it is not ideal. But I do think the deck still has a lot of strength and it had a good showing at YCS Bologna. So yeah, you know, if you want to play a deck that's just like makes you happy because Tearlament, you know, a lot of people enjoy this deck a ton, and it is a good combo deck, which also requires skill to pilot. If you want to play something along those lines, you know, I would suggest Tear, definitely. And as for the fifth deck, as always, let me know what you guys think, which deck actually has to make this list, because there are like 4 or 5 viable options actually. So I could make like another video, but for today, let's just quickly go through them. I will give a couple strengths and weaknesses, and you can let me know which deck you think has to make the list. So obviously we have Pearly. There's also a Fire King and Centurion. All of them made top cut in like actual representation, so they were featured on the pie chart because enough players topped with it. And I have to give props to all of these decks. Like Pearly is a little weird because a lot of hand traps actually hurt it, but it's still really, really strong if they get to Noir, and they do have a lot of advantage with all of the cards that special, add back, draw, and do all of that. Fire King is a bit of an underdog. People didn't really respect it as much, I think, but it is really, really solid at what it does. There's also Centurion, which, you know, Calamity is just really strong, and it has a ton of space to play non-engine. A lot of those cards are actually Bestios. Well, a lot of builds are featuring Bestios and also Horus cards, is what I wanted to say. And with Bestios, you're actually able to make your Synchro 10s or even 12 sometimes. So if you get disrupted, it's a little easier to play through disruption. And there's also Infernoble, which, you know, the deck is really strong, but you need to be good enough to for the deck to really shine, if you know what I mean. Like, if you don't really have the skill to decide in that particular situation what you're trying to play around or how to play through things, I don't think you're going to be as great with Infernoble. Like, the deck is probably not going to carry you unless you put in some work, but if you do, it is really, really good. And I also, of course, wanted to talk about Runic Bistio. I think the deck is insanely strong if piloted by a good player. I think with this deck, it's not gonna carry you if your opponent knows what's up with your deck. Like, if I'm playing against a good Runic Bistio player and against a bad Runic Bistio player, the difference is going to be really, really obvious. So when I know which cards to deal with and how to disrupt them, you know, a bad player is probably not going to be able to do that much. However, if you know what you're doing, it's really, really tough to beat this deck because the grind game is insane. Bistios are really good against most of the top decks, and you just have solid matchups all around. So yeah, you know, this deck is like, it is out there. You need to respect it. It's also nice against Rogue because your Runic cards just work as utility cards against so many different things. And yeah, you know, I think we definitely have to respect this deck. So with that, I think that's going to be it. I obviously gave you more decks than just 5, but let me know your thoughts and which deck you think has to make the number 5 spot on today's list. And of course, like the video if you enjoy it. Ding the bell so you are always notified when I post, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.